Okay, so today's talk, basically what I'm doing is giving you an overview of some of the ideas of the inner observer in relation to transformative creativity. It's part of my PhD, as Maria said, and the PhD covers some of the foundations of the idea of the inner observer. And those are drawn from cognitive science and then mystical traditions, mystical Christianity, Sufism, and Buddhism. And after that, there is primary research where I interview people around their phenomenology of inner observation. And there I'm speaking to people who have worked with the Enneagram and encountered it and finding out how they use it as a self-reading system. So how they use it to interpret themselves and use it for personal awareness and self-regulation. So I'm really interested in this idea of self-reading, using tools, or what you'll see I call psychotechnologies, following John Vervaeke. And then the last section of my PhD is about the implications of these insights for anyone really who influences other people's sense of themselves, who informs other people's self-reading. I think this is really critical because it's quite a powerful position to be in, that you're influencing the way in which people understand themselves. So that could be teachers, therapists, helping professionals, but anyone who works with systems, which they might be using unconsciously. So I would like to make this a lot more conscious. What kinds of models are we using to read ourselves and how? So today's talk, what I want to do is look at the context. So why do I actually care about this at all? And then look at some of the reasons why metacognitive self-awareness is so important. And then look at some of these psychotechnologies that have been emerging over the last few decades and why I say they're convergent. So at a very basic schematic level, we're talking about the inner observer as a kind of witnessing consciousness that is non-objectifiable. So we're not talking about your ideas of your identity, like I'm a mom or I'm a PhD student or whatever it happens to be. This is about the pure awareness that is able to witness your experience and able to witness your thought processes. So you had a little taste of that awareness at the beginning of this session. The ability to pull back into oneself, to notice. And hopefully we get to a point where we are able to do that with non-judgment and access those states of awareness that are described in mystical traditions of non-attachment. And if you look at some of these things here, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the cultivation and the creation of a stable inner home. Evagria speaks about the nu, the mind, and he speaks about impassibility, which means that it's not swept away by every passing event, that things, that contingencies and all the ephemeral things that happen to us in our lives don't break our equanimity and our centeredness. So ultimately that's what we're working towards, is to be based in an inner awareness that is stable and self-distantiated from a lot of the things that cause us suffering. So these are perennial themes across the different mystical traditions that I'm looking at. And there's also a lot of cognitive scientific evidence for the benefit of cultivating the self-awareness across multiple levels of our experience. So it's not just in terms of that ease of being. So that's really what I'm looking at. And this is the most simple kind of schema of self-awareness. Every tradition thinks about this differently, and there are multiple layers and different conceptions of Atman and how this is related to universal consciousness, etc. So this is put up as a very provisional and loose guide to where I'm going with this. And in it, there are two basic dimensions of self-awareness or metacognition, which is an awareness of internal process and then the ability to self-regulate. So this is a basic frame just to get us started. And what I'm saying in my overall thesis is that the self-awareness, the self-reflection, and the metacognitive processes are a prerequisite for cultivating a stable base within this inner observing consciousness. And if you look at this quote here, we're talking about making a more permanent default state that is based in that sense. It's called there the anchoring. So to be anchored in that state. And my argument is that we can't really do that without this level of intrapersonal awareness. And basically, I won't talk about it today, but if we don't do what's in the orange box, we basically are spiritual bypassing. So if you take psilocybin or LSD, or you go and sit in a cave for a week, you're probably going to have a peak experience where you experience the nature of your own awareness. And you'll have a fleeting experience of this transcendental consciousness, this awareness that is unclouded by rumination and all the things that you would be witnessing. But those experiences are transient. And what we're trying to do is in working through, in going through our experience and creating space for it and holding it, we're able to make that more stable inner home in the, whatever you want to call it, body, mind, heart, mind, the non-objectifiable I. So there are many different ways of thinking about it, but hopefully that gives you some clarity on the framing. So I've complexified that a lot, and I want to give you a sense of what I've done around this complexification. Let me just make this a bit bigger. Okay, so what I'm doing in this thesis, because I'm so concerned with systems that we use for self-reading, is I'm locating this within a discursive context, within the ethnosphere. So there's a realm of ideas to which we have access. And this will be very different depending on our socio-historical time period that we're in and what ideas we're exposed to because of our education, our cultural context. So I've put a few things in this top layer that is about our discursive context and that within which we're immersed psychologically. So I've put here Hayek, the neoliberal economist and the kind of father of free market ideas, unregulated market. I've put in the Cynefin framework for thinking about complexity, Copernicus, a symbol of pride, gay pride, and then I put in a Fauvist painting. And this is to illustrate that these are the kinds of ideas that shift consciousness and shift our way of thinking about reality and about ourselves. And I've put in some that were revolutionary. Copernicus was, almost driven out of town for speaking about a heliocentric solar system rather than a geocentric one. Gay rights were completely, unthinkable a few centuries ago. And here we've got the Fauvists, and the word Fauvism comes from the French term for wild beasts. So their art was so dramatically transgressive of any conventions of representation that they threw the establishment. So within this ethnosphere and kind of library of available concepts, we draw things from there in order to be able to interpret our own existence. So every way in which you think is formed by what you've managed to get out of the ethnosphere. So you might think of yourself in psychoanalytic terms. You might read yourself in terms of Viennese psychoanalysis or Kleinian object relations. But the idea here is to become aware of, where do my ideas come from? What do I believe? And where did I get this idea? And especially in this work that I'm doing, where did I get the idea of myself? And how do I construct myself? How do I overlay conceptual frameworks on my raw phenomenological experience, of which is more an existential idea of, here I am, conscious in the world, and dealing with that existential abandonment and making sense of it through these frameworks. So there are different kinds of thinking, feeling, and agency that occur within our being. And what I'm doing is I'm saying, what kinds of self-awareness happen within these different domains of experience. So not entirely arbitrarily, because there's a lot of evidence for the existence of three different integrated yet discrete centers of intelligence, being the brain, the heart, and the gut center neurologically. So I'm not going to go into that, but there is a lot of neurobiological evidence for the existence of these three centers, and that, so I'm using them as spaces that we can be aware of, parts of our being that we can be aware of. And there's a kind of reciprocity around the self-regulation as well. So you would have seen that just by breathing, you were able to downregulate your nervous system, probably calm down and quieten your mind. So it's not just that our minds control our bodies and actions. There are these feedback loops, biofeedback. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of this. So I'm saying that there are three kind of domains of awareness, and describing them in this PhD. So what does it look like to be metacognitively aware? So to be aware of our own thinking. And one of the ways is to know, where did I get my ideas of myself? And that's really my focus. What hermeneutics am I using? What symbols am I using to map my own consciousness? And then being aware of things, John Vervaeke talks about propositional knowledge, perspectival knowledge, and participatory, or three forms of knowing, participatory knowing. And for us to become aware of these three areas within ourselves. So where do I get my sense-making strategy? What knowledge am I drawing on? What paradigms do I find myself working from? So I like phenomenology. Other people really love empiricism. But to know, where am I coming from? And to be able to make conscious choices about that. And to notice one's own preoccupations and lenses, and the ways in which one's thinking has been conditioned. You know, to be aware, okay, I was educated under Christian national education, so I've probably got a pretty warped idea, you know, of race, guaranteed. So we get more critical reflexivity if we're aware of where our perspectives come from. And then we become more able to tolerate ambiguity, etc. And then our participatory knowing is thinking about what our problem-solving strategies are. So when confronted with something new, being able to say, okay, how am I going to approach this task? To say, notice learning anxiety. That's more on the feeling side. And being able to question one's beliefs about, say, maths, and have a different orientation around how am I going to engage with this subject intellectually and cognitively. So through doing this, I mean, all of my research is about what happens when we do this and what the evidence is for the value of metacognition. So you'll notice here that these metacognitive tools or ways of reading the world, say, some of them are going to be, or they're all going to be drawn from this ethnosphere, this library of ideas, and we're going to personalize some of them. So if you're a Christian, part of your worldview is going to be Christian. You're going to have a particular map of reality informed by what you've come across. So my whole reality is very determined by the Enneagram, and that comes from the 1960s human potential movement. So I like to relativize that, not to just work unconsciously within that. And then there's my favorite neurobiologist, Robert Sapolsky. So, our thinking space is dominated by particular ideas. And the more we can become conscious of that, the more we can relativize them and think in new ways and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't have to see the entire universe through the perspective of, Dave Snowden's complexity theory. So, and then at an affective level, affect as in feelings, is being able to have a moment-to-moment awareness of what is arising in your sensory, embodied, emotional experience. So how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling stressed in your body? So it's a deep phenomenological awareness of what's arising at a somatic level that has got an emotional dimension to it. Do you feel safe where you are? Do you feel safe in relation to the people in this room, for example? So this will be where we have emotional co-regulation with people in our environment, and some of the popular language around this area of our experience is around EQ. So in the space of the heart is where we experience empathy and interpersonal connection. So it's much less about critical reflexivity around our mental processes. It's what's going on with me here and now. And we'll also be able to notice there some of our emotional compulsions, our projections. So it's not purely somatic. There's obviously a relationship there. And this yellow bar here is also just indicating that we're going to be self-interpreting at a somatic level. We're going to be labeling our emotions based on our ideas and our mental constructs. So how we experience our anxiety is going to be informed by the self-reading maps that we've got as well. So when I work with the affective domain, I like to try and get beneath those constructs and into the raw phenomenology. Like, what's happening when you listen to somebody in conversation, and this, like in marriage counseling particularly, what's going on in your body when the person is speaking? So someone can speak to you and you can feel your throat constricting, the hair on your back of your neck standing up, and we worry about naming those sensations later. But how do we become aware, moment to moment, of what's arising in the self? And then the self-regulation piece is about responsivity, agency, self-efficacy. So there's a lot of theory there, a lot of cognitive science in all three. But here we're talking about kind of self-efficacy in the tradition of Bandura, Varela. I'll just love John Vervaeke, so you'll just see him again and again. And then underneath this whole story are some of our foundations in terms of our biopsychosocial experience. And these will be things like our genetics, kind of raw instinct, epigenetics, in utero experience, trauma. So you see, I'm applying words here that are concepts. We don't have, you can't say anything about this without without constructs. But I think you'll see what I'm getting at here. The raw kind of brute reality that happens to us, the contingency that we're born into is here. And a lot of thinking around this is just that this is the real, the reality that we're working with. Okay, so that's the kind of model, and I just need to stop share so I can get out of that slide. So obviously that model is arbitrary as per my entire way of thinking. I'm not making any truth claims about a whole lot of boxes being an accurate model of reality. It's very much with the awareness that the map is not the territory, just that some maps are more helpful than others. So I have found this map helpful in organizing my thinking, and maybe that will be of value, just to have a sense of how am I mapping the human consciousness and within a context. So this transformative creativity question is very important to everyone, because we're talking about a global context in which we are dealing with an existential threat. So this infographic about the average temperature change increase, you don't have to watch the news for more than 10 minutes to know that we are in very deep doing at a planetary level as a species. And transformative creativity is about how are we going to engage with this reality. So cognitive science is all about our evolution and adaptation, and this is our biggest challenge ever in terms of what are we going to do and how are we going to adapt. So transformative creativity is about how do we change the whole map? How do we change our thinking fundamentally? How do we transform our conceptual space? That's how Margaret Bowden speaks about it. So it's looking for concepts that fall outside our current problem framework, being able to basically rethink our reality. And we need to, in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to be wrong. We need to find what is fundamentally wrong in our thinking and be prepared to throw it out. So that's really a kind of loose definition of what transformative creativity is. If you look at this quote on the top right there, it does involve processing at a meta level, and genuine creativity always does. So if you think about the Fauvists, if you think about Picasso, if you think about any of the big aesthetic shifts in art or music or architecture, they're just as much about art as they are about changing the techniques and processes. And in fact, the biggest breakthroughs are more concerned with redefining art or redefining the way in which we see the world. So paradigm shifts are when we have a very new way of framing the problem, and we realize that the questions we've been asking need to change as well. So this is what I think is called for in our current reality. We have to rethink the way that we think. And there's that Einstein quote that we can't solve the problems that we created with our old thinking using the same thinking. It's more eloquently said somewhere, and I think it might be misattributed to him, but you get the picture, that we can't solve our current crisis with the thinking that created it. We need some kind of breakthrough. So if we look at these ideas of creative adaptability, there's a lot of new thinking about resilience versus robustness. So in organizations, 20 years ago, we used to say we've got to come up with a robust 5-year strategy. If somebody says that, you know that they are stuck in an old paradigm, because nobody says that anymore if they've read any complexity theory in the last 20 years. What we're looking for is resilience, which means flexibility. Species that couldn't find resilience in the face of change were fragile and broke. So robust is associated with rigidity, whereas resilience is flexible and fluid and responsive. And so what we're looking for with this resilience is a whole lot of new ways of being in the world. And the metacognitive aspect of that and the self-reflexivity involved in achieving more resilience is being able to kind of loosen some of the fixity in our thinking and in our problem-solving approaches. So we're going to try and eliminate cognitive bias. Cognitive bias are fixed ways of seeing the world, or they're reactive, or they're unconscious. And often they've been historically conditioned, and it's difficult for us to become conscious of our biases and give them up. So changing our ways of framing, and then at the more effective and interpersonal level, again, these three divisions, becoming less attached to our one way of seeing the world, to become less defensive about our view and emotionally charged about something and easily emotionally triggered. So more resilience also means more flexibility emotionally, so that we can have a constructive dialogue around things that need to change, rather than escalating oppositions, on every topic, whether it's Democrat versus Republican or vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, whatever it is, that we're able to be more emotionally and interpersonally responsive rather than rigid. And then in terms of our engagement with the world, to be able to have more awareness of feedback loops between ourselves as agents and our environment. John Vervaeke talks about optimal grip. It's a really embedded sense of our agency, and that has come about because of our evolution in context. So it's not a dualistic subject object mindset. It's about cognition being embodied, embedded, and our agency embodied and embedded. So we invented cups that have a handle to fit our hand. So he does a lot of examples like that. It's really fun listening to him speak about that. So he speaks about optimal grip, and he speaks about the dynamic coupling of agent and arena. So he speaks about this agent-arena relationship, and he speaks about consciousness as the interface between the agent and arena. So there's quite sophisticated thinking around our awareness in context. And the more meta-aware we become of the ways in which we can conceptualize that, the more fluid and responsive we're able to become. So that, that dualism, that sense of subject-object, linear causality, we're able to move out of those ways of thinking, and it opens up new possibilities for us. So if you look at the climate change example again, the old way of thinking about sustainability, people used to talk about the triple bottom line, and they used to talk about nature as a stakeholder and that kind of thing. Well, we've realized actually nature is it, and we are nature, and we're embedded in nature, and without nature we don't exist at all. So our lungs evolved to breathe this air, so we're in no way disembedded from the ecological context. So thinking around that is changing fundamentally. So nature is not a stakeholder or an input. Nature creates certain boundaries. Here there's a model of an ecological ceiling, and if we go beyond what nature can sustain, we break the whole system. So worldviews around our place in the world have changed radically. And I like to use this as an example because the same applies to our thinking about ourselves. That our ways of thinking about ourselves have shifted dramatically. If you think about Freud as a major disruptor in his so-called discovery of the unconscious, to cognitive behaviorist models of the self, Jung, there's so many, but the idea is that there are many and that we are using different ones, and how are we using them, and what are the action implications for how we conceptualize ourselves. So I want to do a little, you've probably seen this before, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's nicely illustrative. So if you look at this, if we talk about changing the landscape, changing the way in which we think about a problem, this is a very famous problem. I'm sure most of you have come across it. The 9-dot problem. So if you draw these 9 dots on a piece of paper next to you, and you try and join them with 4 lines only, 4 straight lines, no lifting your pencil and no retracing. Just do it. I'm giving you a minute. Do it in front of you. Join the 9 dots with 4 straight lines. Make sure you don't cheat by lifting up your pencil, and see what happens. So this example here is, you're probably approaching this with a certain set of boundaries in your mind. And John Vervaeke calls it a salience landscape. So what you pick out in this problem is very specific. So you might be seeing a square as the frame and wrestling within that square and wondering. And so you're bringing a whole set of cognitive approaches to the task based on how you're seeing what's in front of you. What Bowden says is transformative creativity is about breaking out of that. Vervaeke talks about breaking the gestalt and establishing a new salience landscape where we're able to see other things. So if we want to solve this problem, we have to see that thinking of this as a square is wrong. So that's the transformative creativity moment, is this is not going to be fixed by using a square. So this is the solution to the 9-dot problem. And what you can see is it breaks the assumption that we're dealing within a square. In order to be able to solve this puzzle, you need to see the white space outside the dots as relevant, or in other words, salient. You've got to be able to see that more than just those dots are part of the problem. So I'm going to take you into another example now that you've seen what changing your salience landscape means, what breaks